Hi all. I had an interesting game on Thursday night when Barnet was playing away against Wood Green Chess Club. Traditionally, when we go and play away against them, we generally lose. It was in the North Circular League, and they were, up until that match, they were unbeaten. We actually managed to beat them. On my particular board, I drew. John Piggott beat Odeon, an international master, on board 1. Alex Efelontis drew. And actually, our hero on that evening was Mike Jones on board 6, who was completely outrated by his opponent, who was about 155, and managed to win. I'd like to do that game, hopefully after this game. So, as black, my opponent played d4, and I wanted to surprise the opponent in the opening a little bit. So I actually played for the Albin counter gambit. So after d5 and c4, I played e5. It's an interesting gambit which gives black a little bit of play. If white doesn't know the theory of it, white could be in trouble here. Unfortunately, it turned out my opponents had played an IM. I think Richard Pert, he was saying, and he drew with Richard Pert earlier in the season, forcing Richard to sort of play knight c6 like he had against me. On the other hand, I'm not completely convinced here that knight c6 is the best move. Maybe e takes d4 straight away is, although it's like Ribka's suggestion without any opening book. I've also checked this on chessgames.com, and actually statistically this is not doing too badly. If white's pawn is on d4 and there's no potential for a pawn on e3 or c3, then that pawn is not as solid as in the game. As we'll see in this game, with a pawn on e3, it was quite a solid point d4. So maybe I should have just taken straight away after this seemingly passive move e3, just e takes d4. One thing I do want to say as well, before the game I was looking at in theory my positional play. I wanted to try and improve my positional play before this game, and I was looking again at past examples where I had rooks on the 7th, or I didn't play rook on the 7th, and because I thought I was losing material. And I wanted to make use of a new idea in general terms, that if I was going to play strong positional moves, I would be more prepared in this game to make them into positional sacrifices. So I had that, even before the game I was thinking, I wanted to play quite dynamically, as well as surprise the opponent in the opening. So that was basically my philosophy for this game. And so, okay, the first part of my philosophy wasn't really that effective. So he played e3, seemingly, quite comfortable with the territory here. So I played knight c6, which, as I say, maybe it's not as good as e takes d4. He took on d5, and now after knight c3, he's encouraging me to play bishop b4, but he's getting, that d4 is going to be quite strong now. After bishop d2, I give up my dark square bishop, and it's a kind of Shigurin type position. This old Russian master was into piece play, and the knight on c6 objectively, it's blocking the c pawn, so black can't really play c5 as easily later. But on the other hand, black at the moment's got a lead in development and piece pressure in theory. So after knight f6, knight f3, castles, I did start to think I was almost in trouble actually, because basically, if white can get in ever rook c1 and rook c5, then that queen's going to be, evictable with tempo. He plays bishop e2, but after knight e4, there was a moment, during the game, in the sequence of one move actually, where I wasn't quite sure if I was worse or better actually, because after castles here, I spent a long time thinking that, actually maybe just bishop e6 here, because it kind of ties down that rook to the a pawn, so maybe this is not going to be as possible. And if he ever tries to do something like move the knight in f3, maybe I've always got f5 to try and stop white coming down the centre with a later f3 and e4. So how are these bishops going to be liberated? If the bishop goes to e1, I thought that was going to be quite passive. So I thought it was quite a complex position to assess. If the queen is vulnerable there, what are the concrete ways that white is going to gain a tempo on it? Well, actually, he did find quite a clever way. After knight e1, so I was now concerned about the possibility of f3 and you know, maybe later rook c1 and c5. I played actually f5, and this is quite a committal pawn move, and he just plays the natural looking knight d3, which already it threatens knight f4, but also in some variations knight b4. So this isn't that pleasant for black. In fact, I think black is worse here. As I said before, this pawn on d4 is nicely, you know, reinforced by the pawn on e3. So maybe, you know, back in the opening, knight c6 was an inaccuracy, because now, you know, these points e5 and c5 seem to be, you know, good strategic outposts for the opponent. I try and shut them down systematically. So I first played g5, just stopping knight f4, and after bishop f3, there's also now some threats of just bishop takes e4, and if queen takes, maybe knight c5, so hitting e6, e4 and b7, as well as the potential still of, you know, the rook c1 to c5. So I wanted to shut down the use of c5, so I played another pawn move now. I played b6, and here my opponent played rook c1. So this is a very interesting position. Maybe this wasn't as incisive. What is Rybka saying here? Going for the g5 pawn with h4. That's quite interesting, but I'm not completely convinced by that. But it gives that as the best move on brief analysis. But my opponent playing rook c1, we have an evaluation apparently of about 0.23. I play rook ad8, and potentially I think my opponent can't dream anymore of a later f3 or e4. So the situation is, you know, how will the queen get evicted? But on the other hand, where is the queen going? It is actually attacking a2 here, but my knight is loose in this particular position. On the other hand, his bishop might be loose. So after rook ad8, he actually intensifies the pressure on the knight by playing queen c2. And I look at a couple of ideas here which don't seem to work. This seems to be very uncomfortable. If bishop d7, I thought he had knight b4. Again, actually, for some reason, Rybka's crying out for this h4 move as well. But actually, no, it's switched the knight b4 as the strongest. I thought this was the strongest because, you know, in this kind of position, if my rook moves, then I'm losing the c7 pawn. And I think that's going to be quite bad. If queen takes c7, though, apparently there's bishop b5 here, and black is gaining the advantage. Actually, yes, hitting the... I didn't actually see this continuation, so this is okay for black, but there's a stronger move here, according to Rybka, for white. Simply maybe a4, just keeping the pressure on, or bishop h5. So you know, maybe this was a playable continuation, this simple bishop retreat. What I did play was the more ambitious queen takes a2. So I try and make sure my calculations are sound here, that I'm not ending up losing a piece. To do that, I had to look at queen takes c6 and bishop e4, and so my pawn ends up on e4, and I was like visualizing, well, if he takes, then I take the queen, bishop takes, rook takes. I can always play e takes d3, so surely I'm not losing a piece. Well, I was hoping that anyway. Now, apparently here, taking on c6 is the strongest move, and not bishop takes e4. Let's have a quick look. Taking on c6, knight takes d2, and here, I mean, I would have ruled this out, but there's actually knight b4 here. This is interesting because there's moves in particular sequences which, although I've seen, I haven't seen in this like particular position this knight b4 idea here. So apparently white's doing very well here. Let's have a look. Knight takes, g takes, queen b3. Now rook c3. So the idea is trying to decoy the queen away from e6. So this is getting kind of hairy. Rook d6, rook takes, rook takes. And now not knight takes, but actually d5, and apparently white has an advantage, a clear advantage. So that didn't happen in the game. Let's go back. In the game, in this position, my opponent actually played bishop takes e4.